In the mid to late 90s, most of us went on the internet for the first time. And to access this new shiny world, one piece of software was key, and that bit of software was Netscape. By far and away the most popular web browser in the world at that point. Most of us saw our first ever websites with Netscape, started to learn about search engines. It was our portal to this new world. Yet, by the early 2000s, Netscape was almost gone, having been replaced by Microsoft's Internet Explorer. The question was though, is this just a natural transition? Was it done by fair means, or was it done by foul? It's time to look at the history of Netscape. Now, Netscape was not the first web browser. No, that honour goes to a web browser called World Wide Web, confusingly enough, created by Tim Berners-Lee, the same person who created the idea of the web. However, that browser only ran on Next computers, and, well, Next is many things, but popular and selling in large quantity is not one of them. Thus, a browser was needed for other platforms, and quite a fair few got created. But the one that rose to prominence, and that was the National Centre for Supercomputing Applications, Mosaic. Yes, the same people who brought us Telnet. In the very early years of the web, Mosaic came to dominate. In fact, it's the first ever web browser I used. And one of the reasons for its early prominence is firstly, it was freely available, and secondly, it could do both text and graphics at the same time. Now, the Mosaic web browser caught the attention of one Jim Clark. That name might well be familiar to long-term viewers of this channel, as he's one of the co-founders of SGI. He'd been using Mosaic on one of his SGI machines, and found he was quite impressed with the whole thing. Jim was also looking to, exit SGI and start whatever his next new thing was going to be. So, he decided to email Mark Andreessen, the lead developer of Mosaic, and have a bit of a chat. Now, apparently after some back and forth, the two of them decided that they would form a new company, and that new company was going to do online gaming for the Nintendo 64. The idea is it'd be something fairly similar to, say, the PlayStation Network or Xbox Live. However, there was one big flaw in their plan, and that was that the Nintendo 64 wasn't going to get released for another 2 years. And Jim should know, after all, SGI was basically making the Nintendo 64. So, with the idea of being a gaming network shelved, Mark Andreessen persuaded them that maybe they should try making a web browser. So, with Jim Clark investing $1.4 million, they created the Mosaic Communications Corporation, a name that immediately screams potential lawsuit. Apparently they thought that Mosaic was not actually a trademark term at the time, and then, they soon renamed it the Netscape Communications Corporation. You know, the thing we now all know it by. Speaking of companies we now all recognise the name of, this video is sponsored by PCBWay. Yes, every YouTube channel's favourite purveyor of printed circuit boards, and also CNC and 3D printing and other things that they do. Look at their website. Oh, that was seamless professionalism, was that? The new company brought together a disparate group of people. Mark Andreessen had brought with him a number of recent graduates who'd been working on Mosaic, and Jim Clark brought a number of SGI engineers who'd been working on systems for a very long time. However, this new team got an incredible amount of work done within the first 6 months, and in October of 1994 they released their first browser, called Mosaic Netscape 0.9. And then in November they quickly renamed it Netscape Navigator, because, who enjoys being sued? It's amazing how quickly Netscape then came to dominate the browser market. For example, just in the January of 1995, Netscape was already at 26% of the entire browser market. By the same time in 1996, they were over 80%. In the September of 1995, just a little over a year since they released their first ever version, Netscape released Navigator 2. And this is where Netscape took a really significant leap forward. This browser introduced a number of features that are still with us to this day. This period represents the peak of Netscape, its golden years if you like. For example, it's on August of that year that Netscape became a publicly traded company and went through what's known as an IPO, initial public offering. And Netscape's IPO broke records. It was the most successful IPO of that period. Initially, they planned to offer the shares at $14 a share, but at the last minute decided to change that to $28 a share. During the first day of trading, the share value peaked at $75 a share, and finished its first day at $58.25 per share. The 25 cents is really important. That gave Netscape a closing value of $2.9 billion. That was a pretty good day for Jim Clark. He'd invested $4.1 million and ended up with a company worth $2.9 billion. And all of that in about 1.5 years. I'm not covering this just because people like big monetary units. No, I'm discussing it because it gives you some idea as to the level of excitement there was about Netscape. Just how infused people were for it and how they thought it was, the future and were willing to put that kind of money behind it. For Netscape's own staff, they'd really exceeded all the expectations they'd set for themselves. As an example, the internal code name for Netscape was Mozilla, short for Mosaic Killer. And in 1995, they really did kill Mosaic. I mean, just in 1995, Mosaic had gone from a market share of about 61% to about 11%. And all that market share, it all gone to Netscape. Netscape was now 80% of the browser market. Now, with 1995 being such a key year for Netscape, we should probably have a little look at their big release for that year, Netscape 2. Now, one of the things to note is just how many platforms this thing was released for. It was released for Windows 3.1, Windows 95, Windows NT, classic 68K based Mac, OS2 Warp, Linux, IRIX, HP-UX, AIX, Solaris, Sonos, FreeBSD. Now, you may be wondering, why release it on all those platforms? Surely Windows and Mac were the two biggest, right? And with general users, you'd be right, those were the two biggest platforms. But Netscape were a little bit more cunning than that, because they were targeting the platforms that were most connected to the internet. Even by 1995, regular people dialing up and using the internet, still not that big. A big chunk of the proportion of users of the internet are based at universities, and universities, well, a lot of them use Unix workstations. So, hence needing to support your AIX and IRIX and Solaris and Linux and BSD. They very cunningly went where the users were at that point in time. However, that said, they were fully aware that Windows was the biggest platform there was. And it's not like universities didn't make use of Windows machines. And also, 1995 was the year that, people did start to dial up for the first time. Not in huge numbers. I mean, it was people who were fairly geeky and this internet idea really appealed. I mean, it probably wasn't your mum dialing up. But this was the year that trend kinda started, and it would accelerate quite a lot by 1996. All of this gave Netscape a really nice growth wave in which they could ride. So as you can see, the conditions for Netscape 2 to do really well were kind of there. It was ready and waiting for a browser to step into that space. But Netscape also turned up with some pretty big features then. Firstly, it supported progressive JPEGs, so an image could slowly load and get more and more detailed as time went on. That was pretty important for the world of dial-up. We also got support for animated GIFs for the first time. I mean, we'd have to wait some time for people to keep posting memes everywhere, but we got the technology to do it then. Netscape 2 also gave us features like HTML frames. Well, never mind. But it also introduced two big things that would really set the standard for things going forwards. One of which we still use today, and the other only stopped getting used, about 3 or 4 years ago? So let's talk about the one that died out first, and that's plugins. Browser plugins were a way of extending your basic web browser to do things that your browser couldn't do without them. A plugin's a bit of software that your web browser loads that is allowed to render something in the web page. So let's give some examples. There was an Adobe Acrobat plugin that lets you view PDFs in your web browser. Other really big important plugins were things like the Java runtime that let you run Java applets, Real Audio for people who really like being bugged by an incredibly annoying client. There was Shockwave and then eventually Flash. There was also QuickTime Video and QuickTime Audio. And, most interestingly of all, there were plugins for VRML, or Vermal as you might call it, which is a markup language for doing 3D environments. The other really interesting thing about plugins is they could be interacted with or controlled by the next big thing that Netscape introduced, the thing that is still here to this day, JavaScript. Now, apparently originally Netscape were going to call that LiveScript, but as Java was just starting to get big then, they decided to call it JavaScript, which confused a hell of a lot of people. Before JavaScript, web pages had been incredibly static. Your web browser loaded its HTML document and any of the associated images, and that was it. It was a static page you could scroll up and down. There was some form control, so you could, fill in a text box and submit it to a web server, but there was no actual interaction within the page itself. JavaScript changed all of that. Now pages potentially could be, quite interactive, particularly when JavaScript was combined with all these new plugins. This changed things so people could offer services through the web browser. It wasn't just a series of static documents anymore. These are the technologies that would lead to initially the live streaming of radio, for example, like the BBC and its content, all done using Real Audio. You'd also start to see the first ever browser games start to appear in Shock. And eventually this would lead to things like iPlayer and other video streaming services, although we need a lot more bandwidth before we could get to that point. But this is where the foundations for all that technology lie. Now, with all this exciting stuff going on at Netscape and with its IPO, it was attracting a lot of public attention, it was attracting a lot of press attention, and unfortunately for Netscape, it was also attracting the attention of a semi-evil Kermit the Frog impersonator, Bill Gates. In an internal memo, Bill Gates had identified Netscape as a future threat to Microsoft, which of course meant in the 1990s that Microsoft were going to have to take care of Netscape. Were Microsoft just going to create a browser that would in some way be so superior to Netscape that it would just magically win the market? Well, no, or at least not according to the US Department of Justice and the European Union. Now, Microsoft obviously were going to need an actual browser. So they did what Microsoft does well when it really needs to enter a new application space, and it bought someone else's. The National Center for Supercomputing had been looking for a way to make use of its Mosaic source base, and had discovered that it could license it out to different companies who would make their own versions of it. One of those companies was Spyglass. Spyglass had created a version of Mosaic that was for Windows, and found itself being approached by Microsoft to provide it with a new browser. The deal was that Microsoft would pay them a very nominal fee, and Spyglass would get a cut of the revenue from sales of Microsoft's new browser application. Initially, this worked out well for all concerned. Microsoft bundled their new browser, Internet Explorer, with the Plus Pack for Windows 95. Spyglass got its piffling license fee, but also got a cut of all the sales revenues from Plus Pack, so it did fairly well. However, Microsoft then decided to include with the next service release of Windows 95, Internet Explorer for free. Which, of course, screwed over Spyglass, because Spyglass was getting a cut of the £0 and pence that Microsoft were charging for Internet Explorer. Now, no one will die of shock to discover that this led to a lawsuit between Spyglass and Microsoft. This resulted in an $8 million settlement in favour of Spyglass, but, key for Microsoft, it meant that they were able to then go on and keep developing Internet Explorer without ever having to pay Spyglass any more money. So Microsoft essentially ended up with the rights to use Mosaic for just $8 million. You can see where 90s Microsoft got its reputation for being pretty devious and a bit evil. And the first few versions of Internet Explorer, to be honest, were a bit rubbish. They really weren't any better than Mosaic, to be honest. And you can see that in that Internet Explorer didn't really make much of a big impact in terms of overall share of the browser market initially. Then things changed. During 1997, Internet Explorer's market share had grown a fair bit. It had grown to about 22%, but Netscape still had 70% of the market. In 1998, that's when things really changed. This is when Microsoft decided to bundle Internet Explorer with Windows 98, their new operating system. It was built in from the start, and it's this decision that attracted the interests of both the Department of Justice in the States and of course the European Union. The problem for other browser manufacturers when Microsoft included IE in Windows is that we were in the period of dial-up, so downloading another browser was actually quite a big effort. You would be online for hours and hours downloading any replacement browser. So the harsh reality for Netscape is most people didn't. They had a browser that was good enough built into their machine. It is also worth noting that IE4 was a massive improvement over previous versions of Internet Explorer. It wasn't just a sort of slightly naff reskin of Mosaic anymore. The other part that made life very difficult for Netscape is, although Netscape was free for regular users like me and you, for corporate users, Netscape charged. However, with corporate users now having a web browser built into the dominant operating system that they used, well, they weren't going to pay someone else to provide another version, even if that version was a bit better. Now, as mentioned before, this was the thing that brought the attention of the US justice system. And essentially they tried Microsoft under anti trust laws, which are there to prevent monopolies and monopolistic behaviours. Microsoft claimed that Internet Explorer was an integral part of the whole operating system and you couldn't run Windows without it, until some software engineer hired by the DOJ proved them wrong in court, and showed 98 running perfectly happily with Internet Explorer having been removed. Now, it's worth noting that Microsoft were actually found guilty, and were in fact going to be split up at one point into two companies, an operating system division and an applications division, although in the end that never actually happened. The European Union also found Microsoft guilty and spanked them for an incredibly large amount of money, and also ordered them to include other browsers with their operating system. All of this, of course, was far too late for Netscape. These cases drag on for years. And by the year 2000, IE had gained a 79% share of the market, while Netscape only had about 21% left, that was shrinking all the time. Now, this did make the fight back for Netscape almost impossible, this dominant market share that Internet Explorer had, because of another tactic that Microsoft used that was never really covered in the antitrust suits, and that's one of embrace and extend. Now, Microsoft had done this in the past. It's where you take a nice open standard and then you stick your own special extra stuff, optional extras on top. So this means, for example, you write a web page in normal standard HTML. It works fine in IE. But then you add some of IE's little bells and whistles, and then suddenly, competing web browsers, well, they can't render those bits. They also made incompatible changes to JavaScript as well, so you had to write your JavaScript to support IE and Netscape. And of course, with IE having the largest market share, if you're a developer pushed for time, which browser are you testing it on? It's not Netscape, is it? There are also technologies like ActiveX controls, which is a way of using Windows software embedded in your web browser, and if you're thinking, wow, that really sounds like a security nightmare, you'd be right. Now, I've talked a lot about what Microsoft got up to and how they really screwed over Netscape, but it's not like Netscape were idle during this period either. They were getting on releasing new versions of their browser, including shortly after the release of Windows 98, releasing what would be a fairly big shift for them. Netscape Navigator went to Netscape Communicator, and this time it included a lot more tools. Yes, of course, there was the browser, but there was also a HTML editing tool that let you design web pages and upload them. There was an email client in there. There was a calendar client built in there. Netscape really threw a lot into that thing. But it'd be fair to say that the browser codebase was starting to creak maybe a little bit. You could see some issues with it in that release, particularly as CSS and other things came along. However, for Netscape, the financial pressure had become very difficult for them to deal with. And eventually in 1999, Netscape would be purchased by AOL. And under its new ownership, Netscape would go on to release more versions of its browser. However, the purchase had created some problems. Although it had shored up the financial footing for Netscape, as it was now part of essentially a much bigger company, the purchase of Netscape had created a whole number of instant millionaires within Netscape who all promptly left. Also, a number of staff just didn't want to work for AOL. For years they'd been deriding AOL's technology and referred to its chairman as the soap salesman. So the purchase of the company they'd been working for the last few years by AOL was kind of the final straw for them. However, just before that AOL purchase, old Netscape had one final big trick left up its sleeve. One that would eventually change the world even for Microsoft. Now, earlier in the video, I mentioned the internal code name for Netscape Navigator, Mozilla, and that name may be familiar to a whole bunch of you, thanks to Mozilla.org, the foundation behind the Firefox web browser. Well, it's not called Mozilla for no reason at all. In the February of 1998, Netscape released its source code to the world, and created the Mozilla organization to coordinate the development of that source code. Now, this was a huge undertaking. No company in the past had done this, taken a big commercial product, cleaned up all the source code and got it to the point where they could actually open source it and then do it. Now, while Netscape continued to struggle under AOL ownership, Mozilla Org created the browser Firefox, which started to grow, until eventually it peaked in 2010 with about 30% market share. Of course, Firefox is still alive and well today, but it does have much less market share than 30% now. Even though it really is an incredibly good browser. I mean, if you've not tried Firefox for a while, I'd give it a whirl. Under AOL, Netscape did release a few more browsers, all the way up to Netscape 9, released in 2007. But later Netscape versions, from 8 upwards, were all based around Firefox rather than the original Netscape codebase. In 2008, a struggling AOL decided it would eventually close what was left of Netscape. I should probably say what happened to Internet Explorer, as although it did dominate for a long time after Netscape, things did not end well for it either. Most of its market share was eaten by Google's Chrome, and a fair bit by Firefox for a while as well. Eventually, Internet Explorer would just become the one-use browser that you'd start once, download your chosen browser, and then never use again. Eventually, Microsoft would pull the plug on it, replacing it with Microsoft Edge, and it would soon pull the plug on that, and essentially Edge is just a wrapper around Chrome's render engine now. Now, so far in this video, the only thing we talked about with regards to Netscape is its browser, and to be honest, that was really what Netscape was about. But, I should mention, the browser was not the only thing that Netscape did. Netscape had an alliance with Sun where they worked on a number of web server and e-commerce products, and that eventually became known as iPlanet and was sold to Sun when Netscape got sold to AOL. That is still actually a product you can buy today off Oracle, although it's available and supported in the sense that any former Sun technology is from Oracle, so For a company that had such a brief life, of only really 6 years, Netscape has had a huge impact on all of our lives. It defined a lot of the standards that are still with us today and have been developed further that have created the web that we now all know and love, and on which you're watching this particular video. Initially, Netscape had perfect timing. It was just the right product at just the right time as the internet was starting to explode. But Netscape in turn helped drive that explosion in the first place. Then after the 6 short years, Netscape was brought down by, well, means that I think we can all admit now were foul. If you got to this point in the video, I'd like to say thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed watching this video, why not press the little thumbs up button below, because apparently it really helps other people find out about this, and you can join us for a nice chat in the comment section below about Netscape and your memories of that era. Or just attempt to destroy my soul with negative comments about the video, so some people go for that option. And of course, as ever, if you really want to help the channel out, please click that subscribe button, as that apparently makes a huge difference to how much the YouTube algorithm can be bothered telling people that we exist. You can even press that little bell icon so the subscribe button does the thing you expected it probably would do.